Team DeWine begins, Team Householder returns. Joining us on Columbus on the Record this week, Kathy Kandinsky, State House reporter for the Columbus Dispatch. Julie Carr-Smythe, State House correspondent for the Associated Press. Dale Butland, Democratic strategist. And Michael Miller, former Franklin County prosecutor. One of the greatest political comebacks in Ohio is complete.
With 52 votes and having received a constitutional majority of all the votes cast, Larry Householder is hereby declared and elected the Speaker of the House of Representatives.
14 years after he left the Speaker's chair under a cloud, Larry Householder cobbled together the votes of 26 Republicans and 26 Democrats to regain the speakership, unseating Ryan Smith. His first call was for bipartisanship.
And we've all got to work really hard with each other to make sure that happens. If you take it seriously and you really want to work in a bipartisan fashion, you can work through all the issues. You can find ways not to have walls, but to have windows. You can find ways to cross rivers, open doors. All these things are possible.
Julie Carr-Smythe, this is a stunner. Not only is he back in the Speaker's chair, it just took one vote. We thought there'd be many votes on Monday, but it just took one vote.
Right. Larry Householder is one of the shrewdest politicians you'll meet. He worked for months behind the scenes. Some might say strong-arming a few folks, or at least strongly encouraging them, or using aides and allies to do so. But he's shrewd, and he did and was willing to reach across the aisle, which is interesting. So you have that dichotomy of somebody who used maybe some real old-style backroom tactics, and somebody who's reaching for bipartisanship at a time that we're not doing that in this country. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens next.
Kathy, what did he have to do to get those Democrats, as many Democrats as Republicans voted for him?
Exactly, and interesting enough, he did not get as many Republican votes, but to the Democrats, he offered them a lot of operational changes. He offered to make them committee co-chair, or vice chairs, I guess it's called. He agreed not to table all their amendments when they come to the floors or come to committee votes, so that the opposing party has to go on record. He did a lot of things like that, and he also promised no anti-union legislation, which was probably the big one.
Dale, you surprised? Will Democrats face any payback for this? And suffer any consequences for voting for Householder for Speaker?
So in his first go-around as Speaker, Larry Householder revealed himself to be an ethically challenged, bare-knuckled bully who who turned pay-to-play politics into an art form. So I was disappointed to see Democrats not only put him over the top, but give him half his total votes. Now, I know they got a few concessions, as Kathy said, but the truth is, Democrats will not be truly relevant in this state until we start winning elections again. And sucking up to people like Larry Householder is not exactly going to make the Democratic brand more attractive.
Like you were kind of close to the Larry Householder thing. You represented one of his aides in the court issues and the investigation. How surprised are you to see he is the leader of the Republican caucus in the House now?
Well, I'm somewhat surprised. I mean, it is a great comeback. There's no question about that. I think I certainly agree with Julie that he's a master politician and did things brilliantly to get to that job. You know, you mentioned a minute ago, Mike, about you wonder if any of the Democrats will be penalized for voting for a Householder. Dale would know much more so than I, but the only thing I saw is like the minority speaker was some problems, perhaps because, if I'm giving the title right, because he voted for Smith. So I think the Democrats are going to have some problems amongst themselves, and obviously the Republicans splitting whatever they did, 34-26 or something like that. There's obviously a split in the party.
There won't be any payback because Labor made this their issue, and they put out word, three unions in particular, put out word that a vote against Householder by a Democrat would be viewed as a vote against Labor. So no, there won't be any payback. This is what Labor wanted.
But I think that there's an argument to be made that this actually weakens the Republican Party, that what Democrats did was capitalize on a divide that existed there. I mean, if you'll recall, our big speaker battle a few months ago was all about they wanted to have their own 60 votes. They didn't want a speaker, and we sat in idle at the State House for 2 months waiting for them to get enough votes, all Republican votes. So in some ways, they capitalized on that.
I was just going to say, it's going to be interesting to watch what Householder has to do to get his Republican caucus united. Because as you said, I mean, they're split now, and more Republicans voted for Ryan Smith than for Larry Householder, so what happens now?
Well, what he could do is he could run the ad that he ran during the primary season. Take a look at this ad that Larry Householder ran last spring. Mr. Bipartisan, here you go.
I'm Larry Householder. I'm a pro-gun, pro-life Christian conservative, and I have the highest NRA rating in Ohio's history. The establishment doesn't like that. That's why a dark money group is airing deceitful ads against me. They're anti-Trump gun grabbers, and they use the kind of swamp politics that you and I aim to end. But they're in for a fight, because where I come from, we stick to our guns.
Conservative Larry Householder for state representative.
Dale Butlin, how does that fit with the call for bipartisanship?
Yeah, so I will say again that I think instead of selling out, the Democrats should have kept their integrity and let the Republicans fight this out on their own. And I'll be very surprised if this turns out well for Democrats, because my experience has been that those who lay down with rattlesnakes usually end up getting bitten.
Mike, could Larry Householder have learned from his first go-around as Speaker? Now, there was an investigation, and no one was indicted. The investigation was ended. They didn't find enough to get an indictment. He spent 14 years, like in Perry County, I believe, and then just got back into the State House. Could he be a different Speaker this time around?
Well, I don't know him to make that judgment, Mike, but I will say that he said that himself, that it's been 14 or 16, whatever years have gone by, and that he's learned a lot, and he's older, and he's more patient and things like that. So we'll see. I just think that in the past, he was allegedly one who was very heavy-handed, very brusque, and would put a lot of pressure on anybody. And I doubt if that's going to change. I think it's almost innate in a person, and I'm sure there'll be some smoother edges, but he's still going to be himself, and just like John Kasich is himself.
He's mellowed a little bit, too.
He has mellowed a little bit, but we'll just have to wait and see with the Speaker.
All right. Ohio has a new House Speaker. Soon it will have a new governor. Mike DeWine takes the oath on Monday. His cabinet is nearly complete. The governor's job is a job he has long sought. He says his priorities will be education and the state's opioid crisis. He says he will sign executive orders right after taking office, but no word on what they might be. Kathy Kandinsky, his cabinet is complete. Mike DeWine's cabinet is complete. And it's apparently the most diverse in Ohio's history.
It's striking.
What does that say about the way he'll govern, do you think?
Well, there's 16 women on that cabinet, which is like triple the number of women we have right now in Kasich's cabinet. He has a bunch of high-level women in high-level staffing positions. I think it's going to. I think it's his. He's already mentioned that his focus is going to be on children's issues, early childhood education, social services in schools, child welfare, things like that. So I expect that we're going to see a lot of that.
The executive orders. Any idea what they might be?
We
Julie,
don't
any
know.
hint?
Well, all of Kasich's will expire as of midnight Sunday, and one of the things he did here toward the end was he added transgender as a discriminatory issue. Will Mike DeWine renew that? I doubt it. Will he put some things in place that have maybe some of the gun-related things that Kasich did on background checks and things? Because you remember that they didn't get a lot of cooperation from the legislature, but Kasich had put some things in place that he called common sense bipartisan gun
Red flags,
regulations,
laws,
things like
and things
that.
like that.
Right.
What kind of governor do you think he'll be, Mike?
I think he'll be pretty even along the boards. I don't think he'll be an up and down governor. I think he'll be very consistent. I think he'll be open to everybody. I do believe what he has said when he talks about the childhood education and opioids. I think as a former prosecutor down in Greene County and so forth, and he's seen, as all of us have seen, this terrible opioid addiction, and I think he's going to, I don't know what he will do. There is no panacea, of course, but I think he's really going to spend time on that, working with probably the Attorney General and the legislature to see if there's anything that can stem this tide. I mean, we're just losing thousands of people.
Democrats, can they work with him, Dale, do you think?
Yeah, you know, I've known Mike DeWine for 25 years, and while I've never voted for him and usually disagree with him on policy, almost always disagree with him on policy, I've always found him to be a good and decent person. I wish him well as governor. In fact, I was just thinking when you were playing that clip that I think I was involved, when I ran John Glenn's last re-election campaign in 1992, and we beat Mike DeWine, who at that time was a congressman. I believe that's the only statewide race that DeWine has ever lost. And so I take a certain pride in that. But let me just say, Mike is a conservative. Mike DeWine is a conservative, but he's far less of a my way or the highway kind of guy than, say, Kasich was. So I'm hopeful that he'll at least listen to those who disagree with him and be willing to compromise when Democrats have some good ideas.
Well, it's important, I think, to note that for his legislative policies person he's hired Dan McCarthy, who's a Democratic State House lobbyist, well-regarded veteran. I think that speaks volumes to what he's anticipating in terms of working with the legislature.
Does this, now going back to Larry Householder saying he wants to be bipartisan and needed Democratic votes to get the position he has, Julie, will that mean that Mike DeWine will be working with the Larry Householder Legislative Caucus that has some Democrats in it, unofficial caucus?
Well, it's interesting. That's a good question, because when Larry Householder was in before, I mean, he believes very much in, my recollection is, the separation of powers, and he was a very strong speaker and didn't always go the way the governor wanted. I think these last few years under Kasich that the legislature largely has sort of let the governor be the guide. I mean, some of that relates to term limits, and they've obviously had their fights, but I think that this will be an interesting one in that way, because DeWine also has a lot of experience, he's savvy, and it could be that Democrats do have a voice because those are the best policies, you know, as the coalition finds whatever the best policy is, it might go either way with either party.
The executive order on discrimination against folks based on gender identity. If DeWine does not continue that's a signal to his conservative voters that's good for them, but would it send a bad signal to Democrats and even moderates in the Republican Party that's one of the first things he does is cracks down on that?
Well, he won't have to do anything because those will automatically expire. So, you know, maybe we'll be writing stories about the fact he let it expire, but other than that news story, I mean, it's not a proactive statement against those groups as much as he'll be making his own proactive statements. But I'm sure they'll be watching, especially on things like guns, abortion, and these kind of things. He said he'd sign the heartbeat bill, for example. And, you know, I don't know how Democrats plan to navigate Mike DeWine's conservative policies, as Dale says, with trying to work with more legislation in the House.
Has to be, John Kasich really has had no relationship with the legislature for the past year and a half. From what we understand, they haven't talked very much, if at all.
Right.
Kathy, just having coffee with lawmakers might help him.
That's going to be one of the big differences. Also, you know, Mike DeWine's going to be in the state more. I mean, Kasich's been pretty absent the last couple of years running for president. DeWine doesn't really have those kind of ambitions as far as I know. So we'll see him more, and I think he will have a much better relationship with the legislature.
All right. Come Monday, John Kasich can fully devote himself to the next step in his career. The governor spent his last week saying farewell. He was at the Ohio State Fairgrounds as they unveiled a building named in his honor. He also squeezed in a few cable TV appearances to criticize President Trump and his wall. Kasich leaves office with Ohio's economy doing much better than it was when he took office. The state's savings account is full, but the income gap in Ohio remains wide, and local governments struggle to make up for his cuts in state aid to them. Michael Miller, 5 years from now, how will Ohioans or Republicans view John Kasich's 8 years in office, do you think?
Well, I think everybody will view John a bit as a maverick. I mean, he has done some things, particularly with the Republican Party, that has not been with the mainstream and so forth, and to the point of not only criticizing President Trump, as a lot of people have done, but not going to the convention in Cleveland and so forth and staying away. I mean, he's just done some things that I admire him for having the beliefs that he has to do it. But I think a lot of people will remember him as a maverick, and I think a pretty good governor. I mean, I think his approval has been fairly consistently high down through the 8 years. He's done well with Democrats, much better than most Republicans do. Probably not as good with Republicans.
Yep.
And he seems to be holding his own quite well with the independents. So it depends, I suppose, Mike, what he does in the future, whether he really runs for Republican nomination, whether he has a third-party campaign, which I find really pretty unlikely, or whether he goes back into, as a news anchor on cable TV or something.
What's his signature piece of legislation over 8 years? Is it Medicaid expansion? Is it Jobs Ohio? What would...
I think Medicaid expansion is the most visible. I mean, he bucked his party to do that, extended health insurance to some 700,000 low-income adults. I think that one's hard to top.
That one went with, too, his message of sort of the people in the shadows, and having to go against your party. All of those narratives worked well with that action, too. I would say that Jobs Ohio is huge, though, and he did many other things like that in the sense of sort of blowing up the way things had been done before, merging departments, eliminating departments, shrinking agencies and that kind of thing. So I think Jobs Ohio and privatizing that entire operation, taking it away from ethics rules, public records laws, he might look at that as quite a signature accomplishment.
I think Kasich's going to have kind of a dual legacy. The first is what he did as governor, say for the first 6 years or so, and then the second will be what he did as and after becoming a presidential candidate. During the first 6 years, he was pretty much a standard issue conservative Republican. He pushed tax cuts that overwhelmingly benefited the wealthy. He balanced his budgets by cutting aid to schools and local governments. Yes, he did do the Medicaid expansion. That was pretty much a no-brainer in terms of the finances of it because the feds were contributing 90% of the money. Yes, he gets some credit, I suppose, for vetoing the manifestly unconstitutional heartbeat bill, but let's not forget the more than 20 bills that he did sign that chipped away at women's health care and their right to decide whether and when to begin a family. The presidential candidate, John Kasich, was more kind or gentler, but I don't know if anybody knows whether that was a genuine conversion or a politically expedient attempt to look like a more moderate alternative to Donald Trump.
And getting back to Mike DeWine, I mean, this is an interesting point because Kasich was kind of two different people over the course of his governorship. And so what were Republicans looking for when they voted to stick with the Republican Party in November? Because, you've got Mike DeWine kind of had his own brand as somebody in politics for so long, but that Kasich effect, if you will, of sort of maybe DeWine was able to bring in people who liked Kasich and people who liked Trump and walk that line is continuing to affect the party, I think.
You know what you're getting with Mike DeWine. He's been in office for 42 years, and he's pretty steady in his viewpoints. He hasn't really changed that much, Kathy.
No, he hasn't changed that much, and I don't really expect him to change a lot from this administration. I think he's going to continue Jobs Ohio the way it's structured. I'm sure he's going to continue Medicaid expansion. As I said earlier, I think we're going to see him focusing mostly on children's issues.
The local government fund, Mike, that's the rural counties in particular, rural communities have really say they've suffered because of this. And Kasich wanted to consolidate some local governments. That was sort of the stick he was using to try to get local governments to become more efficient. Didn't work out that way. What happens now with that? Does that government fund get restored? Do local governments have to consolidate and share services, that kind of thing?
I don't know, Mike. What he did obviously did hurt a lot of local governments. There's no question about it. It benefited some groups and hurt others. And the smaller counties, particularly, losing that money has strapped them in a great way. Now, again, I don't know whether the new governor will look at that any differently. He does have the experience of coming from not a large county, but perhaps a mid-county, Greene County and so forth, and may look at that a little bit differently. And I'm sure he'll be receiving a lot of pressure from those counties to do things a little bit differently so that they can enjoy more income. And I know they need it.
Yeah. Lawmakers looking to restore some of those cuts?
I think they are, but I mean, we'll have to wait and see what the budget, and he'll roll out his budget here in the next few months. and we'll see exactly what his priorities are and whether there's money in the budget to direct more aid to those local governments.
The rainy day fund is very full, as you mentioned, and that was really, I think, a lot for Kasich's purposes in running for president, to be able to point to that. And so they might be able to draw that down some and have a less restricted budget next time.
All right. While the impact in Ohio is limited, the federal government remains partially idle. Democrats and Republicans continue to fight over President Trump's demand to spend nearly $6 billion on a southern border wall. Democrats from Ohio are pretty united. They oppose spending money for the wall. Ohio Republicans' positions are a little more nuanced. Conservative Jim Jordan stands firmly with the president, while Congressman Steve Stivers and Mike Turner, for example, a little less so. Senator Rob Portman says he has a solution.
Well, I'm introducing a bill this week that I've introduced over the last several months with John Thune, and it simply says $25 billion over 5 years for border security, some of which will go toward new fencing, and then dealing with the DACA issue, dealing with those kids who came here as children through no fault of their own. I think that's a nice compromise. I think it's clean. I think it's simple.
Portman and Senator John Thune of South Dakota introduced that bill about a year ago, but it went nowhere. Dale Butler, that seems like a reasonable compromise. Border security package, some money for a fence, DACA gets solved permanently.
Yeah. So the problem with Rob Portman's proposal is that, which is to link wall funding with the Dreamers, is that it was Lindsey Graham's idea first. And less than 24 hours after Rob Portman did that television interview, Vice President Pence killed it by telling Lindsey Graham he spoke with the president and the president will not go for the linkage of the wall with the Dreamers. Mike, I think for our viewers, let's take a moment just to explain how completely nonsensical this shutdown is. Because the president can't get Congress to make taxpayers foot the bill for a wall that he repeatedly promised Mexico would pay for, the president has shut down our government and told some 800,000 federal workers, about 50,000 of whom live here in the state, to either stay home or to work without pay. This includes the Coast Guard, DEA and FBI agents, TSA screeners. In other words, the very people, the same people who are doing jobs and protecting us from the things that the president says he wants to prevent through his border wall. I mean, that's how absurd this thing has become.
Julie, you looked at airports around the country and how the impact it was. I was at the airport on Sunday and I saw the TSA folks working there without any money, but they were not getting paid. They were doing their job.
Right. There was talk that they had staged a sick out, which is because they are essential workers. They can't strike. And some of them had simply gone out sick. Maybe it was sort of a pseudo-union action, but what their union president said is that they simply, a lot of them needed to pick up some extra work, or maybe they needed to stay home because they couldn't afford childcare without a paycheck. And I feel like the problem has worsened from what I've been reading toward the end of the week, is that now, some people are just quitting those jobs to get other ones because they don't make a lot of money.
More than other government shutdowns, Donald Trump dominated the first really 2.5 weeks of this story, Mike. But now in the last few days, we're starting to see the stories of how it's affecting airports and small business loans and Coast Guard patrols and families and how. So now we're starting to see the impact of the shutdown, which when it happened under Clinton, we saw those impacts right away.
Well, Mike, that's true, but I read in the paper this morning from the Washington Post columnist blaming it on the Democrats, that they won't compromise, they won't talk, and so on and so forth. We're going to hear this all over the place. I yearn for the days when Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill could argue all day and then go have a drink together, and things seem to be settled out. But I don't think we're there, and I've seen, as we've all seen, some of the new congressmen, the Democrat congressmen, the words they've used, the just unbelievable stuff that they have said, not on politics, just the trash talk and so forth, and then expect somebody to sit down and deal with them.
Yeah, the same president who uses the same kind of trash talk.
I'm not arguing that deal. I don't think one doesn't make the other one right.
Look,
it's hard to imagine how this is going to end.
This shutdown may be popular with the president's base, but both the president and his party are going to pay a very, very deep price with the vast majority of the country. Polls show that 2/3 of the American people do not want to build the wall, and they're holding the president responsible for the shutdown by a more than 20-point margin.
All right. We'll leave it there. Time now for our final off-the-record parting shots. Mike Miller, you're up first.
I think we're going to see with the new Attorney General, David Yost, a very, very aggressive Attorney General. David is one that has never stepped back from any issue or problem, and I think you'll see, again, a very aggressive 4 years in that office.
Dale.
As bad as the shutdown has been for Trump, things are about to get a whole lot worse because early next month, the president's former lawyer and fixer, Michael Cohen, is going to testify publicly in Congress. What's he going to talk about? The payoffs to porn stars, the felonies that he says President Trump directed him to commit, and maybe some stuff about that Moscow hotel that Cohen was negotiating for Trump while Trump was running for president. This could be a John Dean moment. And we all know how Watergate turned out.
Julie.
I wrote a piece on the transition to the Mike DeWine administration. We'll see a lack of volatility after things like the Trump presidency, which have been very volatile, and in the case of governorship that we've talked about today. A lot of crazy things happened in the beginning of both of those administrations that I don't believe we're going to see here.
Common Waters. Kathy.
I'm hoping the DeWine administration will get to work on Medicaid and find out why 700,000 people have been removed from the rolls in the last year.
All right. John Kasich had a building named for him at the State Fair, even though he refused to continue the tradition of spending a night at the State Fair, like at the sheep barn or the dairy barn. We asked Mike DeWine this week if he would pick up that tradition. Apparently not. As of right now, Mike DeWine has no plans to do as Jim Rhodes did and spend the night at the State Fair, which is too bad for us and for late night comics. That is Columbus on the Record for this week. Check us out online, Facebook, Twitter, and our website, WOSU.org. For our panel and our crew, I'm Mike Thompson. Have a good week.